The story of Iran's renewed solid fuel missile drive begins far from any launch silo. It starts at chemical plants and port terminals, where bland-sounding consignments, sodium perchlorate, dioctyl sebacate, and other innocuous-seeming agents quietly define the pace at which a missile arsenal can recover from war. In early 2025, Western officials began tracking a pair of Iranian cargo vessels, the Golbon and the Jiran, loading containers in Chinese ports. Their manifest described an oxidizer feedstock that's familiar to any propulsion engineer, sodium perchlorate. Once converted into ammonium perchlorate, AP, it becomes the oxygen engine of solid propellant, the heavy, chalk-white heart that allows a missile to spring off the rail with brutal, immediate thrust. When the Financial Times revealed the sailings, the numbers jolted policy circles. If processed, the sodium perchlorate aboard could reportedly yield roughly 960 tons of AP, enough by Western estimates for around 260 medium-range missiles. Reuters relayed the details and added route specifics, the ports, the containers, even the expectation that the ships would make the run in about 3 weeks with no port calls. The destination, Bandar Abbas, southern Iran. The customer, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. The timing mattered. In June, a ferocious 12-day war with Israel had scorched Iranian infrastructure and forced Tehran to expend a significant portion of its missile and drone inventories. Rebuilding meant chemistry, oxidizers, plasticizers, binders and metals, as much as advanced guidance kits or composite casings. European intelligence later assessed that, by late September, additional consignments totaling around 2,000 tons of sodium perchlorate had reached Iran from Chinese suppliers, a surge aimed at reconstituting depleted stockpiles. When contacted, China's foreign ministry responded that it was not familiar with the situation and emphasized that Beijing consistently implemented export controls on dual-use items in accordance with its international obligations and domestic laws and regulations. At first glance, sodium perchlorate sits in a grey zone. It is not by itself the missile propellant that arms a rocket motor, but any missile engineer knows its significance. It's a direct precursor to ammonium perchlorate, the dominant oxidizer in solid propellant, often accounting for around 70% of the mixture's mass. In industrial quantities, this single input can throttle production lines, slowing them to a crawl or, as intelligence officials warned in January, feeding an output sufficient for hundreds of fresh motors. The shipments and the sanctions collided in April 2025 when the US Treasury's OFAC struck an Iran-China procurement web. The designations describe sodium perchlorate and dioctyl sebacate, the latter a plasticizer that softens and stabilizes propellant, moving from the PRC to Iran for the IRGC. The language was unambiguous. Scott Bessent, the US Treasury Secretary, said, Iran's aggressive development of missiles and other weapons capabilities imperils the safety of the United States and our partners. It also destabilizes the Middle East and violates the global agreements intended to prevent the proliferation of these technologies. To achieve peace through strength, Treasury will continue to take all available measures to deprive Iran's access to resources necessary to advance its missile program. Scott Bessent, US Secretary of the Treasury. That sanctions package laid out a network, Iran-based Saman Tijarat, Barman Trading Company, China-based Shenzhen Amor Logistics, and several chlorate producers and intermediaries inside China that shipped sodium chlorate, a precursor step towards sodium perchlorate, or supplied dioctyl sebacate. Individually, those entities might look like forgettable nodes in an industrial supply chain. Collectively, they form a bridge from Chinese plants to Iranian mixers and casting pits, where slurry becomes propellant and propellant becomes inventory. In sanctions enforcement, the bridge matters more than any one plank. Beijing's position has been to disclaim knowledge of specific shipments while stressing compliance with export controls and international obligations. In January, when the Financial Times first reported the Golbon and Jiran loads, China's embassy in Washington said it was not familiar with the report, a short statement, but one that signaled a careful legal stance amid sensitive allegations. We are not familiar with the report, Chinese embassy in Washington statement. For Iran, the equation is brutally pragmatic. Solid fuel favors storage, mobility, and surprise. Liquid-fueled systems can be potent, but they demand time and infrastructure to load, draining away tactical secrecy. Solid motors, once cast, sit ready. In the June war, Iran threw a mix of ballistic missiles and loitering munitions at Israel. Debris photos examined by analysts in the aftermath showed familiar components and, in some cases, the telltale fragmentation patterns of solid fuel stages. Restocking after such a campaign requires chemical throughput at scale. That is what sodium perchlorate deliveries, measured in thousands of tons, promise. The Bandar Abbas context adds another layer. In late April 2025, a catastrophic explosion tore through Shahid Rajeh port. Independent reporting and analysis suggested a chemical fire, possibly involving oxidizers like perchlorates or nitrates, set off the chain reaction. The exact cargo has been contested in public, and Iranian officials have alternated between denials and negligence findings. But the episode underlined a basic truth. In the wrong conditions, heat, confinement, contamination, friction, oxidizers are as dangerous at rest as they are essential in flight. The country's largest container gateway, already tied to sanctioned entities, became a case study in how volatile the supply chain can be. In the months since, enforcement actions have looked to interdict the bridge, naming, shaming and sanctioning firms in Iran, China and transshipment hubs. OFAC's October actions targeted procurement for AIO and SBIG, the core of Iran's solid fuel enterprise. Sanctions are not a stop switch, more like friction applied to a moving belt. They raise the costs, lengthen the timelines, and occasionally seize up gears. But as long as there's demand in Tehran and supply in or near China, new intermediaries will be tempted to step in. That's the policy dilemma now confronting Washington, Jerusalem, European capitals, and Beijing. On the American side, the argument is that impeding oxidizer flows now reduces the number of missiles Iran can field later, which lowers the probability or severity of a future exchange. On the Chinese side, officials insist that export control compliance is being observed, and where a substance isn't explicitly banned, Beijing may see the matter as a question of domestic regulation, not international violation. In practice, this transforms the debate into a fight over dual-use boundaries, what's outright prohibited, what's merely suspicious, and who bears responsibility for downstream military uses of upstream civilian-rated chemicals. Technically, the line between sodium chlorate, sodium perchlorate, and ammonium perchlorate is straightforward chemistry, but complex policy. Chlorate can be electrolytically upgraded to perchlorate. Ammonium salt exchange yields AP. For a missile program recovering from war damage, these are the rungs on a ladder to rearmament. Facts on the ground, like late September arrivals totaling approximately 2,000 tons, cited by European intelligence, suggest that Iran has been climbing those rungs quickly. If the FT's earlier conversion estimate holds as a ballpark metric, thousands of tons at the precursor stage translate into hundreds of potential AP-filled motors, depending on yield and production efficiency. That is not an academic number. It's an operational tempo. Inside Iran, the IRGC manages a vertically integrated effort, sourcing chemicals, casting propellant, assembling stages, mating guidance kits, and confecting camouflage for storage and transport. The more solid fuel units enter the inventory, the more mobile launchers can be loaded and distributed. In the June war, Iran's concentrated salvos tested layered defences, Israeli, US, and allied. The lesson Tehran appears to have drawn is not that missiles fail, but that more missiles are needed to saturate defences. Oxidizer consignments, in this view, are a rate-limiting catalyst for volume. For China, the issue is strategic and reputational. Beijing has sought to play a statesman-like role in Middle East diplomacy, mediating between Iran and Saudi Arabia in 2023, calling for de-escalation during 2025's hostilities, and projecting itself as a neutral energy partner. Yet the supply chain reality, Chinese companies appearing in sanctions press releases for sending missile-useful chemicals to Iran, cuts against that narrative. The official answer has been narrow and legalistic, case-specific denials of knowledge and restatements of export control compliance. There are good reasons for this posture. A hard public stance against such shipments would risk alienating Tehran and complicating China's energy security. An admission would invite accusations of abetting proliferation. The chosen middle road is a kind of diplomatic non-commitment. Deny knowledge, pledge compliance, and move on. We are not familiar with the report. Chinese embassy in Washington statement. Beijing has consistently implemented export controls on dual-use items in accordance with its international obligations and domestic laws and regulations. China's foreign ministry spokesperson statement. In Washington, the language has sharpened. Scott Bessent's April statement framed Iran's missile program as a regional and global threat and tied Treasury's moves to a broader strategy. To achieve peace through strength, Treasury will continue to take all available measures to deprive Iran's access to resources necessary to advance its missile program. Scott Bessent, US Secretary of the Treasury. The press materials also spotlighted specific companies, STB and Shenzhen Amur Logistics, among others, telegraphing to banks, shippers and insurers that touching these transactions carries consequences. Sanctions, after all, operate not just by law but by chilling effect. The practical question is whether enforcement can keep pace with procurement. Oxidizers are large volume chemicals. You don't move thousands of tons invisibly, but you can move them ambiguously under general chemical designations via front companies through ports where customs risk assessments struggle to distinguish between fertilizer-adjacent inputs and missile-adjacent precursors. The Shahid Raji explosion offered a grim tutorial in how dangerous such ambiguity can be even before the chemicals reach a military site. Investigators pointed to storage and handling failures. Officials lamented negligence. Ordinary families in Bandar Abbas counted the dead. Wherever the truth lies in that specific case, the broader moral is clear. Oxidizer logistics carry public risks. What happens next divides analysts into three camps. First, those who argue for tight multilateral export controls that name and list perchlorates alongside their ammonium derivatives, closing the loophole by explicitly controlling precursors. They note that when the MTCR and UN lists lag behind practical realities, enforcement agencies are forced to play semantic whack-a-mole. Aligning lists with real-world engineering would, they say, remove the wiggle room in which procurement networks thrive. Second, those who emphasize maritime interdiction and financial pressure because thousands of tons must sail on identifiable hulls. Watch lists, insurance flags and payment interdictions can make the sea lanes inhospitable to suspect consignments. The January reporting on Golbon and Jiran, naming ports, routes, even container counts, illustrates what that looks like when it's working, visibility that discourages would-be facilitators. Third, those who argue that deterrence, military, cyber, covert, remains the only language that truly slows Iran's missile advance. They point to the June war and suggest that only hard power will meaningfully alter Tehran's calculus. From this perspective, sanctions and export lists are necessary, but insufficient speed bumps on a highway Tehran has no intention of exiting. Here, the counter-argument is that hard power without supply chain denial simply encourages bigger stockpiles next time. For Tehran, the calculus is cold. Solid fuel MRBMs provide regional reach across the Gulf, into the Levant, and under certain configurations, deeper. Paired with drones and cruise missiles, they form a strike complex designed to saturate defences and impose dilemmas, defend bases or cities, conserve interceptors or fire them and risk empty magazines. For Israel, Gulf states and US forces, this is the challenge, denying the growth curve of Iran's solid fuel capacity before it overtakes the rate at which defensive magazines can be replenished. Oxidizer consignments are a leading indicator of that curve. For Beijing, there is a reputational hedge at stake. China's Middle East posture aims to be that of a responsible power, a stabilizer. Continued press revelations about perchlorate flows from Chinese suppliers to Iran complicate that story. The more such reporting accumulates, from FT scoops to Treasury designations, from European intelligence summaries to independent investigations, the harder it becomes to maintain plausible deniability in the court of global opinion, regardless of legal fine print. Beijing's own stated line, however, consistently implemented export controls on dual-use items, signals that, as of now, China intends to hold to its carefully scripted compliance rhetoric. In the end, this is a race between chemistry and policy. On one side stand tonnage figures, conversion yields, casting schedules, and transport manifests. On the other hand, sanctions lists, export control schedules, interdiction task forces, and diplomatic démarches. The 2,000-ton figure circulating in European intelligence and echoed across regional outlets is more than a number. It's a production forecast, a sketch of how many motors might be poured, how many launchers loaded, and how quickly a battered arsenal can spring back. A final note on precision. Sodium perchlorate is not explicitly named on some UN lists the way ammonium perchlorate is, and that legal nuance has been exploited before in other theatres. But the practical truth, accepted by engineers, understood by strategists, is that precursors decide capacity. If the consignments continue, so will the conversion. If the conversion continues, so will the casting. And once the casting is done, the trucks begin to move. In Washington, that logic underpins tighter enforcement and an unapologetically hawkish tone. Iran's aggressive development of missiles and other weapons capabilities imperils the safety of the United States and our partners and destabilizes the Middle East. Scott Bessent, US Secretary of the Treasury, a line meant not only for Tehran, but for any suppliers, freight forwarders, or port operators tempted by grey zone commerce. The strategic message dovetails with a technical one: slow the oxidizer and you slow the arsenal. The detail about sodium perchlorate may feel esoteric. It isn't. Think of it as the oxygen in a room. Without oxygen, a spark is harmless. With it, a spark becomes a flame. And with enough oxygen in the wrong container, a flame becomes an explosion. If policy can reduce the oxygen in Iran's missile rooms by policing supply chains, tightening lists, and punishing facilitators, the sparks may still fly, but the fires will be fewer, the blasts weaker, the nights quieter. Until then, the world will keep reading port records and sanctions ledgers, watching ship trackers crawl from Taikang and Daishan toward Bandar Abbas, and passing statements from Beijing that are careful to the comma. The chemistry of rearmament is not subtle, neither are the consequences when it succeeds. US Treasury and State Department releases detailing sanctions on sodium perchlorate and dioctyl sebacate procurement networks, Iran Watch on the role of ammonium perchlorate, and Chinese embassy's response. Iran International and other outlets citing European intelligence about approximately 2,000 tons arriving in late September. Washington Post and AP investigations into the Bandar Abbas explosion and the risks around oxidizer logistics.